All right. Thank you for joining us for this on-demand session at CLS 2021 entitled Imago Dei, a framework for authentically Catholic anti-racism. My name is John Reyes. I am the Director of Research, Program Evaluation, and Innovation for the Roche Center for Catholic Education based out of Boston College. And I'll give a brief moment to have my colleague introduce himself as well.
Hi, thanks, John. My name is Mike Warner. I am a graduate assistant at the Roche Center for Catholic Education at Boston College.
Awesome. So we're glad to spend the next couple of moments with you, and depending on where you're watching and who you're watching this with, we pray and hope that this is sort of a good opportunity for you to dive into how we can address authentic anti-racism within our Catholic schools and our Catholic school systems. So a brief introduction to kind of set the context for what we're looking to do through this time together. There are three objectives that we'd love to target. The first one is we want to be able to articulate the theological and spiritual foundations of Imago Dei. What is it that we're basing this off of that is steeped into the rich tradition of our faith and our contemporary challenges? The second section of our presentation, we want to provide an opportunity to describe the leadership dispositions that are needed to lead transformational change for anti-racism in Catholic schools, understanding that the theological and spiritual foundations provide us the why, and we have a good opportunity to dive into the literature as to how we manifest that change. And then finally, we'll conclude with potential action steps to help you translate authentically Catholic anti-racist leadership into your local context. Whether your local context is your school community or your diocese or archdiocese, we have some practical recommendations that are built off of the work that we are doing with leaders through our Imago Dei program at the Roche Center to help support their change efforts to create a more just world. So let's start first with why Imago Dei. And Imago Dei is the name and the branding that we've given our efforts to support anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Roche Center. Without saying too much about the current social climate, there's a great story in the Old Testament about Queen Esther and about how she was thrust into this position, not just of representative leadership, but very transformative leadership to protect the people and her families and her friends and the nation that she was charged with leading. And there's a great quote in the book of Esther when she's conflicted with this decision that may lead to conflict, that may lead to discomfort, where she questions, well, what's her job? What's her role? And the person advising her tells her, well, you know what, if you remain silent at this time, and this is in Esther chapter 4, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. But Esther's challenged when her uncle Mordecai says, and who knows, but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And those last couple of words, for such a time as this, really rings and resonates with us here at the Roche Center. And we look at the current moment and we think, if there were a voice or voices or people or disciples that were needed for the time which were presented in our society, why not us? And why not this moment? And so we see the current moment in our journey of faith, both individually, collectively, as an opportunity to reclaim the discussions on diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism within an authentically Catholic framework, and understand that it's the fullness of our faith that informs our response, rather than trying to augment a secular worldview into our the truth, beauty, and goodness of our faith. And so we see Imago Dei, we see this opportunity as a way to reclaim the discourse and ground it into what is authentically Catholic, what is authentically true, good, and beautiful. And as a team at the Roche Center, and our team involves the folks that are directly involved in the work that we do across our various programs, but also educators that work in the field and that are passionate about representation and are passionate about equity for students, for families, and for the communities that they serve. We try to discern this question of, well, how is this work going to bring about a more just world? Right? And that's sort of a common theme that runs throughout our initiatives at the Roche Center. And we landed on this idea that for us to create both lasting change in our schools and our communities, and for the short-term change that's needed to facilitate that long-term lasting change, we need to focus primarily on internal formation and internal disposition. And there's a great passage in scripture that talks about this idea that from the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. And this is in Luke chapter 6. From the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. And we see that the work of DEI and anti-racism in Catholic schools and in Catholic dioceses and archdioceses lies primarily in how do we form the hearts and minds, spirits, and dispositions of those within our communities and our schools, especially our leaders. And knowing that if we have a laser-like focus on those internal dispositions, then from the fullness of that internal disposition and conviction will come the external manifestation, the structures, the systems, the policy changes that will lead to a more just world. So with that in mind, knowing that internal formation, that unlocking the fullness of heart, mind, and spirit is needed to address sort of the larger problems that diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism challenge us to, well, we need to answer the question of, well, what are those dispositions of heart, mind, and soul? Where do they come from? How do we know that they're based in the fullness of our faith? Right? And there are 4 key tenets that we want to go through here to briefly kind of introduce you to and give you an opportunity to reflect on as you consider the applicability of these challenges within your context. The first foundation, right, that drives our work in Imago Dei is this idea of Christian anthropology, understanding that the work of DEI is essential to affirming and restoring the dignity of the human person within this tradition. Right? So Genesis 1 talks about how humans are created in the image and the likeness of God. And Christian anthropology is all about understanding, well, what are the implications of being creatures that are made in the image and likeness of God? How do we reconcile the diversity of the human race, of human peoples, of their convictions, of their ideas, of their viewpoints, of their experiences with this idea of being made in the image of this omniscient and omnipotent God? So we see DEI first and foremost as a way to help us affirm and restore human dignity. The second piece that we want to touch on here as a theological foundation is an understanding of how Catholic social teaching informs how we create a more just world within our schools and our communities. And so grounded in Christian anthropology, the work of DEI is a direct response to the call for solidarity in defining and grounding human rights. Right? So Catholic social teaching, right? The tenets of Catholic social teaching talk about these dueling principles of solidarity and subsidiarity. And DEI is a way for us to be able to reconcile those two pieces, but then also be able to translate the challenges of solidarity and subsidiarity into our contemporary context. And St. John Paul the Great talks about this in his World Day of Peace message in 87, and talks about how our simple fact of being born into this world creates a condition of solidarity with the other person, and that solidarity must coexist with the richness and the diversity of the human families, right? Just as our existence in this world, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, affirms a right and a conviction to dignity, being born in this world also requires a sense of solidarity that we must live out in our schools and our communities. The third piece here talks about interior formation. And this is drawn in the pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, really talks about this in a very substantial way. And this is a great quote here that talks about how the challenge of responding to racism in our schools and our communities relies on personal, ongoing conversion, right? That any ills or any gaps, any pains, any brokenness that we see is reliant on our individual capacity to engage in personal, ongoing conversion. And that ongoing piece is something that my colleague Michael is going to talk about in a little bit here, this understanding that this conversion, this seeking truth, beauty, goodness, reconciliation, all of those pieces are ongoing pieces and less of a check mark, right, for us to address. And the final foundational theological piece that grounds our work here in Imago Dei is this attentiveness to structures and systems. Open Wide Our Hearts again addresses this idea that actually comes up in other church documents. I believe in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, it talks about the existence of structures of sin. And so the church has a history of talking about how sinfulness and brokenness embeds itself into these institutions. It embeds itself into policies, into programs. And so, yes, we need to address racism through personal ongoing conversion and be able to facilitate that for others and be instruments of reconciliation in our personal journeys, in our personal walks of faith, that we must also simultaneously be aware that that personal ongoing conversion is incomplete without understanding and addressing and being attentive to the systems and structures that perpetuate inequity and preserve barriers to wholeness and dignity that may have come out of our individual insufficiencies, so to speak. And so we're going to give you a moment to pause and reflect here. So in a moment, I'll have you hit the pause button, turn and talk with a colleague, turn to talk with the folks that you're with, or maybe take a moment to just write and reflect. Which of these theological foundations resonate most with your personal calling to leading in Catholic schools? One of the things that's so important to the work of DEI is understanding that we need to be able to affirm the experiences that people bring to the table, and understanding the diversity of experiences and the inclusion of that diversity is essential for us to really capture and address these problems authentically. And so within that space and that line of thinking, we invite you to take the next couple of moments to pause and to reflect on which of these theological foundations really resonate most with you, which ones strike at your heart, which ones make the most convincing case for you as to why the work of anti-racism and DEI belongs in Catholic schools and is the work of Catholic schools. So take a moment to pause and reflect.
Well, thank you, John, for that. I don't need to reinforce the foundation that John has helped lay for us and the background that we've got to work with. It's a great resource for us as we try to do this. But the question now is, how do we make real an authentically Catholic anti-racism in our schools, in our communities, in our world? And that is, how do we move a group of people from point A to point B? How do we do it on budget, on time, and still wanting to work with each other going forward? So that's a constant challenge in any organizational setup. We found two books that would help us with this, that stood out. W. Edwards Deming's Out of the Crisis and Jim Collins' Good to Great. And both of these give us a background on how effective leaders move organizations from point A to point B, doing it effectively, sustainably, and in a way that it is resilient and will withstand the kind of ups and downs that we're very aware of now in our pandemic world. So here is, you can see, these are some of the basic ideas that Deming and Collins use to get an organization from point A to point B. There's a constancy of purpose. Everybody's job is this change. Everybody owns some piece of it, and it's not just one office, it's not one leader, it's not one teacher. Everybody owns this. It comes from values and purpose. It is not about something cosmetic, it's not superficial, it's not a flavor of the month trend. It is real and it's substantial. It's about process rather than product. And if I could use an analogy, it's a little more like a class plan than like a report card. You can change a class plan. You can affect what you do day to day to day. Once a report card's out, you have very little control of that product. It's mostly in the past. Process, on the other hand, is what you can do in your office, in your classroom today. And that's really important. It's a key part of effective organizational change. Sustainable change, I can't emphasize enough that the people who come after you have to be able to inherit this change from you. So it has to work next week, it has to work next month, next year, and as in any organization, there are new people that they will absorb it, and can they build on it? Can they build on what you've done? And love those baby steps. Never apologize for a baby step, because a lot of baby steps together make much bigger difference than a few really large steps. So take the time to appreciate those baby steps, see them in your staffs, in your colleagues, in your community, in your organization, and celebrate them if you have to. Stop and just let them be good. We did review scholarly literature. And in our review of scholarly literature, nobody has the kind of comprehensive view that Deming and Collins have, but they do give us a lot of questions that help us focus what we're trying to do. And specifically, enacting that shared vocabulary you say there, that gets back to the constancy of purpose, that everybody is using language and frameworks that they agree on. They are consistent with each other, and it's helping everybody stay in gear. If I was speak musically, everybody knows what key we're in. It's not a surprise to anybody what key we're playing in if you're good with that. Number two there, that persistency of focus, open-ended change. I think of that as part of our process. Again, keep focus on the process, because that's where you make a difference. The way you do things is how you affect change. And again, those short-term wins, celebrate them, don't stop with them. You need another short-term win. And then the next set there, and I've got three words for you: budget, budget, and budget. If it's not in your budget, you cannot make this change work. It's got to show up in your budget. You have to budget for time, for money, for energy, for the creativity of staff and community. If it's not there somehow, you're asking people to do this in their spare times, and none of us can do effective leadership, especially change leadership, in our spare times. And then that trust and legitimacy. Now we have a little bit of an advantage here, I would say, because Jesus said, "I am the truth." That's our marker right there. If we are true, we can gain trust, we can gain legitimacy. If we look at the truth and are honest with ourselves about it, we're much more, we have an advantage over many secular organizations who don't necessarily have that shared understanding. That's our shared understanding as Catholic educators. And so I'd like to go to another pause. And as we move to this pause, there's two pieces I want to point out. Jim Collins, in Good to Great, identifies something he calls the Stockdale paradox, which is having to confront the brutal facts of your current situation, the hard facts, the stuff that's tough to admit, and at the same time maintaining an unwavering faith in your project. And that's a challenge. Don't be afraid if those brutal facts are scary. Don't be afraid if those brutal facts are discouraging. Come back to your unwavering faith. And again, that language is language we understand. And then finally, we are the church, and we are also the change of the church. And I encourage you to think not as a consumer of a product here. You are a participant in this change. You are a participant in this church. It is yours, and you will own it, and your people will own it. So think about that with these pieces right here, and we'll move on to a next section. Thank you.
All right, so now that you've had a chance to dive into the theological and spiritual foundations and understand the leadership implications of leading this kind of change in your schools, what do the practical next steps look like? Understanding that incremental change is the way to go, that we need to create opportunities for short-term wins, but also think big picture, right? So think about the end game, play to be able to make it sort of through the entire change process. And so we need to be able to balance those larger aspirations with very small actionable steps. And so here we want to offer 3 practical recommendations that you can do with your teams, whether you're working with your principals, whether you're working with your teachers, whoever your team might be. Here are practical recommendations to begin or sustain this change process within your schools and your communities. The first recommendation we have is to establish your purpose, right? What we provided in terms of the spiritual and theological foundations is a synthesis, and hopefully a helpful one, to orient your teams and your communities as to, in general, why this work needs to be done. But the secondary question, and in many cases, the more important one as time goes on, is what is the purpose for our community? Right? So for your diocese, for your school, why are we doing this work now? What is it that we believe individually and collectively that suggests that we ought to do this work? One of the things that we've hoped to be able to at least spark some conviction around is this idea that, yes, racism, inequity, lack of diversity, lack of inclusion are problems to be solved. But in a sense, it could be just as easy for us to be like, okay, those are problems to be solved, but who says that it has to be us? Why us? Why now? And so the question that is worth asking and facilitating discussion around is it our community's role to address these questions? Now, we're a little biased. We'll say absolutely yes. The Catholic school functions so powerfully in the role of building the kingdom of God that it would be for us inescapable or inconceivable to think of not participating in that work. But those are great discussions and questions to have with your critical stakeholders. Why us? Why now? How does this link to our beliefs? How does this link to our history, our purpose, our mission, our vision, and our philosophy? How does this connect with our school's stated beliefs and values? So simply having the conversation and even using these prompts helps to facilitate this question of establishing our purpose. And in fact, that was one of the first pieces that we did with our leaders when we met with them in the summer through this Imago Day program, is have them articulate their purpose, articulate their why, and their why for their community in this time and place. Second practical recommendation is determine your critical stakeholders, right? So you've got your why, you need to figure out your who. Who's going to be tasked with leading this change? Do those leading the change represent those who will be impacted by it? So much of the work of DEI and anti-racism is about representation, about getting voices at the table. Are they the right voices? Can they speak to the multitude of experiences that exist that need to be represented and included within your community? And then how are we creating a space for those leaders to succeed? As Michael was saying, one of the pieces that the literature on anti-racist leadership is very clear about is budget, time, money, resources, people, attention, right? We need to be able to allocate and specify a space for leaders who will engage in this work, whether it's you, whether it's those that you will call and commission to this work, that they have a space, a time, and the resources that they need to succeed, to reflect, to get those short-term wins, to communicate effectively, to be able to address resistance. So know who's leading the change, understand that they need to reflect who it is that is impacted by the change, and understand your leaders to the extent that you can give them the tools and the resources and the belief that they need to succeed. The third recommendation we have is really to go slow to go fast, right? It's very Michael Fullen, like, go slow to go fast. But at the front end, once you know your purpose and your stakeholders, it's so important to determine what are your commitments to the people you are serving. And this is typically a great exercise to do with your leadership team that's going to be working on these initiatives. When we met to sort of lay the foundation for Imago Day, as a team, we needed to figure out, well, what's our role in the change process of schools, right? First, understanding that we had to act upon the belief that as a group of educators, as a group of people of faith, that we could have a positive impact on schools. We needed to define and be very clear to ourselves and to those that we were serving, how are we going to serve these school communities? And so as an Imago Day team, we created these commitments. And so the schools that we're working with in the greater Boston and in New England, on these initiatives on Imago Day, we defined these commitments to them. We said that, hey, you know what, throughout the journey and throughout the process of support, these are the things that we will commit to doing for you. We invite you to hold us accountable to these commitments, and we invite you to provide input on how these commitments can best shape how your leadership is manifesting within your school communities. And this is also an indicator for us to understand if we are going to define and measure and identify those short-term wins, we can look at our commitments and see the extent to which we are manifesting our commitments as a way to surface those short-term wins. So it's great for us as a leadership team, but it also makes clear to the communities and the leaders we're serving what our relationship will be and what they can reasonably expect from us in their work. When we gathered our leaders that we were working with in these communities over the summer, we invited them to define their commitments. We first asked them to say, once you understand your belief, your purpose, your why for your community, understand that in this year that there's only going to be so many things that you're going to be able to do to tackle this larger question of equity within your communities. So we first had them define their visible changes and then work backwards and say, well, as a leadership team, what's the role? They know the needs of their community best. They know the needs of their teachers and the families and students that they're serving the best. And so we invited them to say, based on their needs and based on the visible change you're looking for, what is it that your leadership team can provide to these people to help facilitate this change process? So we'll go to our final pause and reflect here. Invite you to either individually or with the folks that you're watching this with, determine your action steps. Which of these 3 change management ideas, these practical recommendations, can you put into place to further DEI efforts within your school or system? What could this look like? What could the activities look like to establish your purpose? Who are your critical stakeholders? What are the resources that you'll need to give them or reallocate for them to be successful? What are the commitments that you think your leaders will need to make to the communities that they serve to be able to enact the visible changes that they want to see in their community? All right, so let's take it home here. We want to leave you with a couple of pieces that we hope will be useful to you in your journey to bring about a more just world in your schools, in your communities, in your dioceses. If you scan this QR code, you'll get a link to our Google Drive folder that has this slide deck presentation that you can sort of take and adapt however you feel like. Obviously, you have access to this recording, but we've also compiled a bunch of different resources that might facilitate some of the sense-making and collaborative activities that will be essential to your leadership. Michael Warner has been a fantastic addition to our Roche Center team, and his work has been instrumental in curating, in synthesizing, and in communicating the rich body of theological, spiritual, and organizational leadership literature that's informed our work in this program. And so you can access a literature review, some recommended reading that helped inform the creation of this program and the supports that we're delivering throughout the year for these school leaders, and then sample activities that we have used or will be using with school leaders to be able to support these change processes within their schools. So scan that QR code, check out the resources, and as you look through those resources, we invite you to reach out. There's in Open Wide Our Hearts, that quote that talks about personal ongoing conversion. Just before that quote, the authors of that pastoral letter reference Pope Francis. And they reference something that Pope Francis says, where he challenges folks to say that we cannot look at challenges to conversion and growth and think that we are somehow exempted. And it's such a powerful and a humbling statement to say that as people of faith, as leaders, as pilgrims on the journey, that we must reject the impulse to look at a challenge for change and growth and say, well, that doesn't really apply to me. And the same goes for us at the Roche Center, right? So for Michael and myself and the fantastic team members that have contributed to our efforts here, we are seeking that challenge and that growth. So as you engage in these change processes, as you surface areas of success, as you surface areas of growth, as you identify difficulties or shortcomings or ways in which we can expand the theological, spiritual, and relational richness of these efforts, we invite you to reach out to us. That's our contact information. And our work is based out of the Roche Center for Catholic Education. And as we've mentioned multiple times throughout this presentation, our our driving force for this and so many of our efforts is about bringing a more just world through our Catholic schools, right? We see our Catholic schools as kingdom builders. And we understand that the kingdom that we build through our Catholic schools must be one that affirms and restores human dignity, a kingdom that helps us manifest solidarity and subsidiarity, that leads us through ongoing personal conversion and empowers us and motivates us to address the systems, the structures, the policies that might prevent us and might lead to brokenness and division within our societies and our communities. So we hope that this has been a valuable presentation on behalf of Michael and myself and the rest of the Rose Center team. We're so grateful. We hope this is a great opportunity for you to reflect on how you can bring about a more just world within your schools and communities.